Welcome to today's Explainer. We're diving into a situation that honestly feels like it was pulled straight out of a Cold War spy thriller. We are breaking down the highly secretive, incredibly high-stakes sudden visit of CIA Director John Ratcliffe to Moscow. It's a diplomatic maneuver where an absolute ton is on the line, and the information we have paints a truly fascinating picture of modern global geopolitics.
Okay, let's just dive right into this. Why on earth did the head of the most powerful U.S. intelligence agency secretly fly, completely unannounced, straight into the Russian capital? Well, the answer to that drags us right into the deep end of current global conflicts, stretching all the way from Ukraine down to the Middle East.
So let's look at this secret visit. Just to set the stage here, this is actually the first known visit by a CIA director to Moscow since 2021.
You know, trips at this level, they don't just happen on a whim. They almost always signal that a very direct, unmistakable message needs to be delivered in person. If we trace the timeline, things moved incredibly fast. Before Tuesday even hit, the US actually asked Ukraine to hold off on military strikes while the delegation was visiting. Then, by Tuesday daytime, the whole cover was blown. Plane spotters tracked a US Air Force jet landing right in Moscow, and people literally saw a diplomatic motorcade rolling through the city. By that evening, media leaks had completely blown the lid off the story, making this highly classified trip entirely public.
All right, so what were the actual goals here? U.S. intelligence sources were pretty quick to leak the primary geopolitical directives driving this whole mission.
So the crucial point is that this was all about laying down some very specific red lines. The first objective, a direct, unmistakable warning to Russia to absolutely not attack any NATO member states. That was the primary message. The second objective was a severe warning regarding Iran and the critical shipping routes in the Strait of Hormuz.
Just to quickly elaborate on that second goal, the U.S. basically threatened additional sanctions if that strait isn't kept open for international shipping. But honestly, it goes way beyond just the shipping lanes. The U.S. is keeping a very close eye on the deepening partnership between Russia and Iran. Specifically, we're talking about their intelligence sharing and the joint manufacturing of military drones. Let's move on and see how this all builds up. Because a huge piece of this puzzle is how Vladimir Putin might actually be testing the NATO alliance, at least according to U.S. intelligence. To really grasp the immense gravity of the situation, we need to quickly anchor ourselves on NATO Article 5. This is the bedrock principle of collective defense. It simply means that an armed attack against one ally is considered an attack against all allies. So a direct strike on NATO territory? That literally puts a worldwide military response on the table. The stakes really couldn't be higher.
And this brilliantly illustrates exactly why the current atmosphere is so incredibly tense. We're not necessarily talking about a massive conventional invasion here. Instead, it's about hybrid warfare tactics that fall just short of triggering that massive Article 5 response. Take a look at these recent provocations. We've seen drone incursions pushing into Romanian airspace, a Russian missile crossing the border into Poland, and a really noticeable spike in suspected sabotage and cyber attacks all across Europe. It looks very much like a systematic testing of boundaries.
These incidents feed into a very specific, very real U.S. concern, the fear that Russia might actually target the Baltic states with some sort of limited military intervention. And what makes this threat so much worse right now is that the West is facing a severe shortage of munitions. Stockpiles are just stretched incredibly thin between supplying Ukraine and managing the demands of the conflict with Iran.
Now this brings us to a really fascinating split in the narrative. Because depending on who you listen to, you get a completely different story.
Now, what's really interesting about this is the stark contrast in official communication. On one side, you have U.S. intelligence leaking that severe warnings were delivered to Russia about NATO territory in Iran, but then on the other side, you have President Trump going on a radio show and calling the whole thing a semi-routine trip. He completely denied that the trip had anything to do with NATO or Iran warnings, and instead framed it as part of his own push to end the war in Ukraine. So we have two wildly different depictions of the exact same event.
To complete the picture here and stay entirely neutral, we also need to look at what the Kremlin is saying. Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin spokesperson, did officially confirm that contacts took place between Ratcliffe and Russian security services. But he was very quick to clarify that Ratcliffe absolutely did not meet with Russian President Vladimir Putin. And when Peskov was asked about these reported warnings regarding NATO, he was incredibly dismissive. His direct quote really sums up the Russian stance. A lot of such scare stories are being published right now. Of course, they have nothing to do with reality. So officially, the Kremlin is just writing off these Western media reports as total fabrications.
So, this leaves us right at the core of the dilemma. You've got reports of severe military warnings on one hand and flat-out denials on the other. What do these contradictory signals mean for the future of NATO unity? I mean, if the official narratives are this divided, how reliable is the actual deterrence? That is a massive, looming question that's absolutely going to define global geopolitics over the coming months. Thank you so much for joining today's Explainer.